And we're live with George Schire. Thanks for coming on tonight.
Hey, my pleasure. Good to be here.
Appreciate you coming on. And we talked before you came on, but why don't you tell us a little bit about the book that you had written and what it was what it was about and what people could expect if they were to pick it up.
Well, it's interesting because the book obviously is 10 years old now.
Yep.
And the reason that you and I are talking is because I guess there was a little bit of a reliving a negative review that the book got back in 2010.
Yep.
And the interesting thing is that through some of the conversation that came about on the wrestling board is most people understood that the review that it got wasn't a fair one.
Now I read the review. Now obviously we had Jamie Hemmings from Slam on last week.
Right.
And how it came up was I just asked her, I said, has anyone ever given a bad review? Because I know that in the wrestling community, everybody pretty much knows each other. So you're not gonna bash anybody. So I was just curious if that had ever happened, because I'm friends with a lot of authors now, and people ask me for recommendations on Facebook. I'm always afraid that if I say one name and not the other, somebody might get offended. But I had read the review, and to me, it seemed like somebody who was expecting it to be something different than what it was. And you know what I mean? Like doesn't mean they hated it. They just didn't like. They wanted it to be something completely different than what it was. I read the review and I'm like, oh, that seems like a cool book that I want to pick up.
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head. If you read the actual review that the gentleman gave, and then I don't know if you did read my rebuttal to him.
Yep.
I did respond to him. And here's the thing I want to point out up front. If you go to Amazon.com, which my book has been available on since it came out, there are reviews like there are on everybody's books on Amazon that people can leave and give. And all of the reviews are positive. This particular individual, I don't know who he is. I've never met him. I've never heard of him doing, and I'm being honest here, I've never heard of him doing anything else regarding wrestling involvement. Mm-hmm. And I've been around the wrestling business for 60 years. And he's just an individual. I don't know who he is. Now, here's what I want to say that happened. When my book came out, I have been good friends with Greg Oliver,
okay,
who runs the Slam. And it's an outstanding page for wrestling. And I have nothing but great kudos for Greg for what he does with Slam. And I've known Greg for probably 20, 25 years. And we're friends. When my book came out, Greg sent me an email and he said, if you want to send me a copy of your book, I'll be happy to put a review up on Slam for you. Now, what you have to understand when a book comes out, at least in my particular case, my book is published by the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Okay.
And the Historical Society Press is what they're called, but it's the Minnesota History Center. Mm-hmm. So they are all about history. And when they approached me to do the book, basically when I wrote the book, it becomes their book. And if there are ever going to be any revisions to it or anything, I have to approve them. But if I don't, they'll go ahead and get somebody else to do it. Well, that's never going to happen while I'm alive because I wouldn't let anybody touch my book until. But right. The bottom line is that Greg, what I wanted to say is that when a book is published like this, they launch a campaign, the publisher, where during the summer and the fall of 2010, I was on every radio station in Minnesota. They set it up. Go on, review your book. I was on every television station in our Twin City area and some outside of the Twin Cities, where these shows that they have where they'll talk with authors and different people. And we reviewed the book. And it was very common when somebody else would review the book, some wrestling organization or something, they'd send you either the Historical Society or me, and they'd say, send us a copy of your book and we'd be happy to do a review. So that was happening for, several months. So when Greg Oliver sent me the email, and like I say, I've known Greg forever. He's a great guy, and I have nothing but good things to say about him. But I said I'd be happy to. I send him off a copy of the book, and I don't hear anything back from him. And the next thing I know, I started getting a couple of emails from people. They said, holy crap, have you seen this? And I had not seen this review that was put up on Slam. And I have no idea who this guy is. So I go in there and I check it out. And here's this Chris Schramm. And I read the review, and it's like each word I read, each paragraph I read, I became more confused, more livid. But my main concern is who is he, and why didn't Greg Oliver, review my book? I contacted Greg, and he never responded to my inquiry as to why he didn't himself review the book. But he did say I handed it off to Chris, and he reviewed the book. So, as you said, the bottom line is that if you read the review and I can understand his opinion, but my whole problem with it was when I responded to him was he gave the review based on a book that he wanted or he expected. And because it didn't have any of those things in it, the book was awful. That's the gist of his whole review, which I found to be very disturbing. When I responded to Chris Schramm, I said, I asked him in an email, aside from the comments that are on the Wrestle Bookmark site, I said to him, did you actually read the book? And he never, ever said to me that he read it. He would not come out and say, yes, I read it, which I just don't believe he ever did. And so the end result is that is a one highly, very negative, unfair. His comment to me when I emailed him was, if you can't take the heat, you should get out of the kitchen, which I thought was very unprofessional. And after that, I left it alone. I said, you know what? It is what it is. And I moved on until here this past week when Jamie Hemmings puts this thing out there, and I'm starting to get, have you seen this, George? And I'd have no idea about your site, honestly. And then Scott Teal, who is another, Scott Teal and I have known him for 40 years. Scott Teal has Crowbar Press. He's put out dozens of the most outstanding books you can find on professional wrestling. And Scott has a different approach because he puts out biographies and he gets really in depth with the wrestlers. And that's good. There's a market for that. I love his books. And Scott sent me an email earlier in the week, and he said, I'm sending this off to Jamie and he mentioned somebody else. He said, and I'm hoping they're going to put it on their site. But he said, I didn't see this 10 years ago, and this is so unfair what this Schramm guy did to you. And I called Scott, and we spoke on the phone. I said, Scott, I'm not worried about it. I said, it's old, but I'm glad that you're defending me. But now if we look at your site, there's been tons of people that have come in and said, hey, George's book is exactly what he said it was. It's a great resource book, which is exactly what I intended it to be. The one thing that I personally wasn't going to do and 10 years ago, and I probably still wouldn't today, is I wasn't going to write a book talking about any of the really backstage stories of the wrestlers that were going to embarrass them or anything like that, because as you and I spoke off air briefly before the show, literally dozens upon dozens of these wrestlers have been and are personal friends of mine. And what they did in their private lives, I'm not interested in talking about that. Now, if you're doing a biography for a wrestler, that's a different story. They spill what they want and you share it. but my book wasn't about that. My book was basically set up to be a chronological look at wrestling in the beginning, in the AWA, and before the AWA. And if anybody that read the book really did, they know that I start talking about wrestling back in the 40s, long before the AWA was ever even a dream. And it was all NWA territory. And I talk about the formation, how it came about. I give a history of, I do give bios on about 10 different wrestlers that what we called were mainstays in the territory in Minneapolis. Let me point this out. The book originally was going to be titled Four Lights and a Ring. And any wrestling fan that was a fan during the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, they would understand what that title meant. Because back in that era, you had four lights, sometimes three or four, but four lights above the ring, shining down on the stage, the wrestler's ring. And the auditoriums, the arenas, they were dark, just those lights above the ring. And the definition, or the difference is that the modern day product, anybody that's followed it for the past 20 or 30 years, you know that wrestling is all about well-lit auditoriums, lots of pyrotechnic displays, fireworks, blazing music, theme songs for the wrestlers and their introduction to the ring. And you know, the introductions take longer than their matches sometimes. And our era of wrestling was that darkened arena where when a wrestler would come out of the locker room in the darkened arena with that light above the ring, you could sit in your seat and you could hear the rumbling of the crowd as the wrestler got closer to the ring, because the audience would see him coming to the ring. If it was the heel, they were booing, and the booing would get louder as he got to the ring. And the reverse for the baby faces. The louder the cheers got as he got closer to the ring. And then they would climb into the ring, hopefully go to their respective corners, and the announcer would then introduce them to the crowd, and they'd have their boos and cheers accordingly. And that was the main difference. So my title was going to be Four Lights and a Ring. When the Minnesota History Center did the book, they wanted it to have Minnesota in the title, being they were the publisher. And so as we got ready to publication, it became Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling. So I'll stop there, and then you ask me any other questions that you have.
Well, yeah. So is it about, like I said, it's on my list to pick up now, since I like picking up controversial books. But
well, it's not controversial.
Know, right. Well, it's not controversial, but it became it last week. But is it about Minnesota or is it about, or more AWA focused? Because I know Vince probably came in there.
What you have to realize is that even though it has Minnesota in the title,
yep,
Minneapolis specifically was the headquarters for both the NWA in the 50s here in Minnesota, and for the AWA going forward after August of 60, when the AWA was formed. So Minneapolis was always the headquarters. Yep. And any wrestler of that era, when they came to work for the AWA, or if you were in the 50s, the NWA, any wrestler you spoke to, they would say, I went to work in Minneapolis. And that was the AWA. Or I went to Minneapolis. And basically they're saying they went to the AWA. So it's an AWA book after a certain point. There's the first few pages in the beginning of the book where I talk about the formation of the earliest tag team matches back in the 30s, when tag teams were invented, or the idea of a tag team wrestling match. And I talk about the idea of building a heel and talking about Gorgeous George. I go into depth on Gorgeous George being the first real, what you want to call charismatic character, the bleach blonde hair and the strut and the feminine side of his personality that he portrayed. And, he was really one of the first performers, as Luthez, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, would call him. And then I also then start talking about how the NWA was in the Twin Cities and or in the Midwest here, and then Vern Gagne buying the company, Minneapolis, and moving forward. So it is a bio in that sense. The one thing I do in the very beginning of the book is I spend some time on explaining the old story of, when I was a kid growing up, wrestling wasn't something that you normally talked about because there was a division. There were people that said, "You watch that 40 stuff? You know it's fake, don't you?" And then there were those that they believed it. Then there were some that, well, some of it's real. Well, the reality is that wrestling has always been, professional wrestling has always been predetermined finishes. And it's a soap opera.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to build when when two wrestlers or two tag teams are in a program, they call them together, where they're battling one another in a series of matches. They have to get you, as Vern Gagne told me one time, he said, our job is to get them to the arena for a card. But once we have them there, now we have to give them a reason to come back next week or the month after, whenever the next cards are. And so I explain in the beginning of the book an age-old question. I said, is it real? Is it fake? Or is it something else? And I had a question mark.
Mm-hmm.
And then I proceeded to explain the differences. And it really is something else. And I do quote one of the great Texas wrestlers in the book regarding that question, because I will tell you, any wrestler, this is an era you have to take in consideration that back in they called it kayfabe. Have you heard that term?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Back in the kayfabe era, these guys, these wrestlers, they were programmed, conditioned that you don't under any circumstance tell an outsider that our matches are prearranged. It's real. What we're doing is real. And so they would go and Eddie Sharkey, a wrestler here in the Twin Cities, and Eddie trained a lot of guys for the business, guys like Jesse Ventura, the Road Warriors, Crusher Khrushchev, Barry Darsow was his name, a lot of others. And Eddie Sharkey said that his parents actually went to their graves believing that what he did in the ring was real, because he couldn't even tell his mom or dad, and he never did. And that's a fact. And so the wrestlers, if you went up to them and said, is it real? Are you really getting hurt? Or, all the questions that a fan would ask. And a lot of wrestlers got frustrated with that. They really, it irritated them because they went in there and they put their bodies on the line. The thing that's important about the wrestlers is the matches are, I would never say they're totally choreographed, because every match, I saw Billy Robinson and Nick Bockwinkel wrestle, I swear, 100 different times, maybe more.
Yep.
And I can tell you for a fact, I never saw the exact same match with those two guys. They could always do something different. So when you ask a wrestler if it was real or fake, they'd get upset with you. So Nick Kozak, he was a wrestler from Texas, and he came up with the perfect answer to that question. Is it real or is it fake? He said to fans, he'd say, for those who believe, no explanation is necessary. For those who don't believe, no explanation will do. And he left it at that. In my book, I added my own comment after I shared Nick's comment. I said, wrestling was a lot like Santa Claus. It's more fun when you believe.
Agreed.
And if you think about it now, I've got growing kids now, but when my girls were little, and then now we have granddaughters, but now they're growing up too somewhat. But when you waited for Christmas morning and you saw the joy in their eyes when they believed in Santa, that was the whole magic. And we're in the Christmas season. That's the magic of Christmas, believing. So even as an adult, you can believe in that magic for your kids.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what wrestling was back in that era. Now, I had the luxury of way back in the end of the 1960s of traveling to wrestling cards with our ring announcer at the time for the AWA, Marty O'Neill. And Marty was one of the first guys that really talked openly to me when we'd travel. We would go to small towns in Minnesota, small towns that would run a wrestling card. And a small town wrestling card is called a spot show. And you'd usually have 3, maybe 4 bouts on the card, but they were usually held in a local high school gymnasium. They were a lot of times fundraisers for some organization. They'd get the wrestling card to come in. They were different types of wrestling matches, and I would travel with Marty and we'd talk. Well, that led to the fact that eventually back in the late, early 70s, where I was started to be accepted, I guess you'd call it. It's a hard fraternity to get into. But eventually, some of the wrestlers at the time, Vern Gagne and Red Bastien and Ramon Torres was one of my favorites at the time, and Nick Bockwinkel, so many of them, they found me to be a friend. And they knew that I wouldn't go out and spill anything that I'd heard or so when I knew what was going on, I never told anybody. If they thought it was fake, they think it's fake. If they think it's real, that's fine too. But that's where I came from. So when the interesting thing is a lot of people may not remember this, but in 1989, when Vince McMahon Jr., the current owner of the WWE, he came out and he said that wrestling wasn't real. He said wrestling is entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And that was after a lot of scrutiny that he did that, but he basically was doing it so that he could eliminate the state athletic commissions from being at the matches and that sort of thing and not having to pay. And I will tell you how angry so many of the old kayfabe wrestlers were, the old generation. And one wrestler who, I'll let him remain anonymous, but he made the comment. He says, I'd like to see McMahon with cement shoes on at the bottom of the river, because these guys, again, were so programmed that you don't reveal that it's predetermined. And they had been that way their whole life. And now they were being called a fraud and they were being called a fake. And a lot of guys couldn't get over that. Now, most of them that are still with us now, they've accepted it. We've moved on. Wrestling is flourishing, the current product with its own fans today. And, that's great. But so in my book, I do cover that topic and talk about a lot of different scenarios, how they work the matches. Funny story is that I talked about blading in the beginning of my book. And when the book came out, true story, I swear I got my copies in the mail, and Greg Gagne, Vern Gagne's son, he called me and he goes, George, he says, what the hell are you trying to do? He says, you just blew the whole business. I said, Greg, seriously. And Greg is still kind of, to this very day, Greg has still got a hard time talking to fans and really, really admitting that the finishes were predetermined and that we really didn't hate each other when we were in the ring and that sort of thing. But I remind him all the time. I say, Greg, it is over. And people don't care. They watch it anyway because, and they do for the same reason I think I did, Ed. I remember in the kayfabe era when I knew something was going to happen or they were going to have a breakup on TV and they were going to build a program between guys or something, and I'd know it was coming. Part of the fun for me was watching how they orchestrated it, how they worked to it. And that was still fun. I was waiting for that moment, how exactly are they going to do this? I know they're going to do it. How are they going to do it? So I was pretty much like the fans today. I knew it wasn't real, but I loved it even more because of that. And so I do explain that in the beginning of my book. And then basically from there, I do give a year by year chronological assessment with different sidebar notes on the pages. And this was what I found interesting when the reviewer seemed to have missed this altogether. And I know he didn't read the book because he'd have figured this out. In many of those sidebars that I put in there, I put in what really happened behind the scenes that they didn't tell you regarding these two wrestlers or this feud or something that was going on at the time. And I gave you the real story in a little capsule look.
Yeah.
And I did that throughout the book. And I do that year by year, explaining all the different programs, the wrestlers, the pushes they got, different things that sold and didn't sell. And then I have the second half of the book divided into, I guess what you'd call mini bios. I cover bios on the different announcers that worked for the AWA, and really go into, who they were and what they brought to wrestling and how they presented. Each one was different. I talk about all the different masked wrestlers that appeared in the local AWA. And then I give the bios on, as I said to you off air, about the mainstays. And a mainstay back in the territory days, every territory, the AWA, the NWA, whatever city they were in, they had mainstays. And these were guys that basically stayed for the most part of their careers in the same territory. And the feuds and the programs that were created were always built around those wrestlers. So naturally in the AWA, Vern Gagne, he owned the company. And in the 50s, Vern Gagne was a hometown boy. He came from Minnesota, wrestled for the Minnesota Gophers and played football for the Minnesota Gophers, the university. And so he was a mainstay. And then we had guys like the Crusher Lisowski, Reggie Lisowski, who you had some great pictures on your intro to the show on those old videos. That's when Crusher was out east in 1960. And we had Larry Hennig, who was a local wrestler. We had Mad Dog Vachon, who was pretty much in and out of the territory most of his active career. And then you had Nick Bockwinkel, who came here in 1970 and stayed for the rest of his career. So if you looked at all of the results and all of the other wrestlers that would come into the territory, because in those territory days, there were 25, 30 of them, of territories around the United States. And so these wrestlers, they would come into a territory for 6 months to a year, maybe 2 years. And they'd be there. And then when their time ran out, they'd go to another territory, start a different name or a different, different matches. But most of the time they were around these mainstays. So I give those bios on those mainstay wrestlers. And if you read the book, the bios are pretty, without going into how many women they slept with when they were on the road traveling or all of this stuff, which I just don't care to go into. I give pretty decent backgrounds of their respective careers. And then I also covered many of the best, most remembered tag teams in the AWA. And I gave bios of each of the wrestlers that made up those respective teams. So the book overall, and then at the end, I do have a glossary of all of the kayfabe terms, terminology, what everything meant. And Greg also told me I shouldn't have put those in there. But, overall, it is exactly what I planned it to be. It was a history, but I didn't go into any of the really great road stories or anything like that some of the boys are okay to share with now and that sort of thing. And I didn't want it to be that.
Sure.
The other thing I would finally say with regard to the book is that because I was working with the Minnesota Historical Society, my book, you showed a picture of it. I don't know if you can see this, but this is the binding. And so the book, this thick. My manuscript, which I still have my original copy of the manuscript, is about double or more the size of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing is that just like all great movies, there's so much that was in my book. And I did have a lot. I did have a lot more stories that I wanted to tell. But we got into the point with the History Center where they get into word count, logic, obviously the size of the book. The book is 200. What is it here? About 250 pages. If
Okay.
we went with my original manuscript and also adding the additional photos and different things I wanted to include in it, it would have been about 400 or 450 pages. And this is my original manuscript that doesn't have any of the photos included in it. But it was one of those things that I worked with the History Center for, believe it or not, it ended up being about 4.5 years. And they would constantly, these were folks that had known nothing about wrestling. They weren't fans of wrestling. They were a Minnesota History Center.
Mm-hmm.
And so they cover anything history in Minnesota, which you would expect a museum history center to do. And so they would send me notes, and my editors would say to me, well, we need to take this out of the book. And I'd have to go back and defend it. I'd say, whoa, wait a minute. We can't take that out because, and I would explain why we need to leave it in. And then, okay, well, you're the expert, they would say. And, okay, well, we'll work around it. And then they would say, well, we want to take this out. And I'd have to defend that. And this went on for, like I say, about 4.5 years. And by the time we got done with the actual book, there were also a lot of revisions that I had to make to it because in 4.5 years, things happened. Things changed with some of the guys we were talking about. And
Yep.
we had some that maybe passed away and all kinds of stuff. And so it was an interesting project, but I really was at their mercy. And the interesting thing is, and I've teased about this, I would love to publish my manuscript as I have it in my hands, because the actual manuscript and the book that you will buy, there's a lot of differences to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the manuscript, I look through it from time to time and I go, man, I wish I could have included that in there. Or I wish they wouldn't have taken this out. And but the end of the road when the book came out, I couldn't have asked for better people to work with, because one of the things is today, and this wasn't possible 10 years ago and before that, people can self-publish books all the time.
Right.
And by doing so, that's great. But the thing about books, and I don't know how many other authors have told you this, but everybody will say, well, we wish there was a book on this wrestler. We wish a book on this territory, or whatever the subject. The bottom line is that for the most part, these books don't sell, Ed. Everybody thinks, well, you wrote a book, so you're a millionaire. Well, it doesn't work that way. Yeah, I got a nice advance before I did the book. But since that advance, any book that's sold, I get a percentage, a royalty on it. And I get that royalty I get those royalties once a year with the History Center. Anything that's sold on Amazon or through Barnes and Noble, bookstores, the book is available in the bookstores. You can go to Barnes and Noble and they either have it on their shelves or they'll get it for you. But you don't make money on books unless you're really a famous person. And the other thing that I found interesting about in my wrestling office right now, I probably have 250 wrestling books that have been put out that I've personally, I haven't bought every wrestling book that comes out. I've been fortunate enough where a lot of the books have been given to me. And believe it or not, I've done a ton of reviews on books. The thing I would say about doing a review on a book is I've never done a review on a book where I told the the author that your book didn't have this or didn't do this, or I wanted to see this, or I wanted more of this in the book. And that's what Schramm did.
Yeah.
And I've always told people that you review the book on the merits of, first and foremost for me is I want that book to be accurate. And I'll tell you how my book came about. About 2004, 2003, I had already been getting a ton of books that were coming out. And every time I look at them, and I'm very critical, my theory on history, being a historian, is that if it isn't accurate, you don't publish it. You make it factual. And I take people to task when they print things that aren't true, that aren't accurate. So I would get these books in the mail and I'd look through them. And I have to tell you, there were some of them that it was like people made stuff up as they went along. And I remember I'd get frustrated. And my youngest daughter, she said to me one time, because I was complaining about one book, the guy had captions wrong. He had names wrong under the wrestlers' pictures. He had different bios wrong. He had, it was like, whoa. And I was complaining. And my daughter said to me, she says, Dad, instead of complaining, why don't you write your own book? Well, that's kind of where the idea came from.
Yeah.
And I had put some feelers out to different publishers. Didn't get any answers. No answer is your answer. Okay. And I did send it to the Minnesota History Center. And lo and behold, and you said you're a baseball fan earlier to me. One of my closest friends is a huge baseball fan. He's done a number of baseball books. And he had a book published with the Minnesota History Center, which basically covered baseball in Minnesota. Again, that Minnesota tie. And I told him I had sent a note you do when you're sending your idea out, you send a mini bio of what you want your book to be and why they interested.
Yep.
And I told him that I had gotten a teaser from the History Center. And he said, that's where I got my book. You should tell me what. He says, call this person. So he gave me an in. And I called the lady up and, oh, yeah, we'd be really interested. And so we want to do the book. The first thing the lady asked me, she actually came to my house, the person that ran the Historical Society Press. She came over to my house. And the very first question she said to me was, okay, who's going to buy your book? Again, she's not a wrestling fan.
Yeah.
She doesn't follow professional wrestling at all. She said, who's going to buy your book? And I told her, I said, well, now this is back in 2004. I said, well, if I write the book the way I want to write it, my primary audience, now this is in 2004, I said, my primary audience is going to be anyone that is probably 40 years or older. I said, I don't anticipate that it's going to be a hot ticket for the 30-year-old or the 20-year-old that's watching WWE and the modern day product, because the two products, they're night and day in comparison. And she says, okay, now that today, as we sit here, that would be a different demographics, because the people that would be buying my book now, if it were brand new, I would say you've got to be at least 45 or 50 and older to understand the book and enjoy it. Unless you're that rare individual who's 30 years old or 40 years old, and you're interested in how was it back then? And those people aren't as, much around, but they're out there. So that's what I told them. I said, that's going to be the product to my book. And then they asked me what I envisioned it to be, and I told them. They ended up changing a few things that I wanted to do, like I said. And they asked me when I signed the contract with them, they said, how long do you want to have to do the manuscript. I said, well, you have to understand that this book is in my head, and what I don't have in my head, I'm going to get down. I said, let's go 1 year from today. Ended up that 1 year from the day that in 2005, when we were right at the beginning of 2005, when we were talking about this, I said, how about I give you my finished manuscript on April 1st of 2005 or before if I can. Oh, you can have longer. Take your time. I said, no, I want to have a schedule. So on April 1st of 2005, I hand delivered my manuscript to them, and I had it in a box that, I don't know. And from there, they had all kinds of expectations. They were going to have it published by Christmas in 2005. Well, that never happened. Then we were going to have it by Father's Day in 2006 because, wrestling would be a good Father's Day present. Yeah. They had all these ideas, grandpas and fathers for Father's Day. And that never happened. There was always different setbacks and different things. I mean, I had a headache through the whole thing. Well, eventually we ended up, by the time we got done, then they had budget cuts a year or so later, and there were a ton of books that they were not going to publish at all that were on their drawing board. And mine was one they were keeping, but we were going to have to do this and modify the schedule. And so it took 5 years. And when
5 years?
5 years was April 1st of 2005 when I gave them the manuscript. And my book, the official publication date was May 6th of 2010. Wow. That's when it came out. I had gotten advance copies about a month before that, but it wasn't available yet to the public. But here's the good thing: working with, not self-publishing it. My book got tremendous exposure, like I explained to you, with TV and the radio and different podcasts, different wrestling outlets. I did all kinds of them. And for the first couple of years, I mean, my book was selling like hotcakes, to use that old term. And of course, as time goes on, fewer copies are sold. And, now it's 10 years old and new audiences can find it. But it's still out there. Yeah. And that's unusual in a way, too, because usually by a decade, books are no longer even available. They're out of print. And so my book is still in print, and they did do one revision to it about 4 years ago. They allowed me to update some things in it, and I did. But overall, as I said in my response to the reviewer that brought all this conversation about, I said, you didn't read the book. I'm sorry it wasn't what you wanted, but it's not fair to review the book on what you wanted. It's if you're going to review it, you review on what it is. Now, if I would have had tons of errors in the book as far as facts, then take me to task, run me over with a pickup. I don't care. I deserve it. But anybody that knows me, and I would tell you, anybody that's going to listen to this broadcast or is listening to this broadcast tonight, if you know me, you know my reputation. And I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm just saying that, I'm a stickler for facts. That I am a stickler in making sure that history is accurate. And I will argue to my death. If you think wrestling there's a story that you're telling me differently than it is, and I know you're wrong, I'm going to tell you. We have one of the greatest old controversies, and you can look this up if you want to. If you ask a lot of people, today with the internet and Google and all these things, people aren't historians anymore. They can go and Google something and get some answer on some site, and they take it as gospel. Well, we've all heard the saying that not everything on the internet is true.
That's true.
Very true. And one of the most common misconceptions is, and there are sites out there, wrestling sites, that say that Pat O'Connor was the very first AWA world champion. And that is wrong. But it's in those sites, and these people pull it from there, and then they come on and they'll argue. Well, it's right here on this site. Here it says. Okay. But I've got all the programs. I've got all the papers. I've got everything in fact, I have all of the papers that founded the AWA. I've got all the programs that talk about AWA, and Vern Gagne was the first AWA world champion. But people want to say that the AWA recognized O'Connor as the first champion and that he didn't defend the title within 90 days to Vern Gagne when asked to. And so he was stripped of recognition and Vern declared the champ. And that's the way some of those false sites tell the story. But that isn't what happened. Pat O'Connor was the NWA world champion, National Wrestling Alliance.
Yep.
And Minneapolis, the Minneapolis office was part of the NWA since the NWA was formed in 1948. And we had NWA champions in our territory for a whole decade. In 1959, Vern Gagne and promoter Wally Carbo bought the Minneapolis territory, which basically was NWA promoted at the time.
Yep.
And they issued a fictitious storyline to the fans outside that Vern Gagne has challenged the NWA champion to defend the title. And they gave him a 90-day challenge in May of 1960. Now, Pat was the NWA champion. The whole storyline was fictitious in the sense that there was never really an ultimatum issued to Pat. The NWA had agreed to give up the Minneapolis territory because at the time, they were under investigation by the Justice Department for being a monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
And they agreed to give up Minneapolis to show, and then allowing another organization to start in order to show that they didn't have a monopoly. That's the law. That's the short story. If anybody wants to read the full unabridged story of that, there's an excellent book by Tim Hornbaker out there that talks about the untold story of the NWA. Okay. So this story goes out, this fictitious story that Pat and the NWA have not accepted Vern's challenge. Well, all the time, Minnesota is still, or Minneapolis. When I say Minnesota, I mean Minneapolis.
Yep.
It's NWA territory. And so the phony storyline goes unanswered. And on August 16th, 1960, it's announced that Pat O'Connor has failed to defend the NWA title to Vern Gagne. And by default, Vern is now recognized as the first American Wrestling Alliance, it was Alliance in the beginning, world champion. And so Vern is the world champion. But that's one of the great controversies. And there are many other stories that go along through the years that I love talking about and fixing them. And having, I'm kind of an expert on the AWA.
Yep.
But I can guarantee you that if you want to talk about any other territory, be it Florida, Texas, California, Pacific Northwest, WWF or WWF before, any territory in between those, I can talk with you and I can show you programs. I've got a collection that is file cabinets full of programs and clippings and newspaper clippings, and I used to do research the old-fashioned way. When I want to do results records, I would spend hours in the library.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. How did you, compile all the results?
Oh my gosh! As I said to you, I think we said this, when we pre-talked for a couple minutes. I found results so fascinating because it was interesting to me when I was still a little kid. and you'd hear the announcer say, and I'm just going to use an example. They would say, "Fans, we're sorry to report to you that due to the injuries received in last week's match, Pepper Gomez is out of action indefinitely."
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we sitting at home, oh my gosh, poor Pepper, he's out of action.
Right.
Well, I'd get a wrestling program in the mail because I had a network set up even as a younger kid where I would exchange our programs from the Twin Cities with a friend in Tampa or a friend in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Boston, wherever it was. And they would send me their programs. So here, poor Gomez is injured, but I'd get a program and, oh my gosh, he's in the main event out there in San Francisco. Isn't that interesting? So results fascinated me. And so I would start originally when I was still in high school, I would go to my library in the school, and I would try to dig out some of the older newspapers and look at results. And originally it was local, but eventually I would spend time in the local libraries, the St. Paul Public Library and whatever. And whenever I'd go into a city, I'd try to find their library and look at old newspapers to come up with clippings to get results. And so that's the way we did it in the old days. Today, as we said just a moment ago, people can Google something and lo and behold, there's something out there that'll give you some information. But here's the problem. And I don't mean this in any disrespect, but the same as some of these wrestling books that some people have written that have a lot of errors and they haven't done their homework on. A lot of these sites are set up that way too, where they've just taken something they heard from somebody else and they put it on the site. They didn't live it. They didn't have anything to back it up. And so the one thing that I can do, Ed, is that with any territory, I can show you how the history went down. I can show you who won, who lost, what the program was, when they left, where they were. I mean, you can throw a wrestler out to me in the kayfabe era, and you can say a name, and I can say, yeah, he was in Boston in 19 whatever.
Right.
And a lot of that's up here. But as I always say, don't ask me if I ate lunch today because I honestly don't remember. So that's how I did it, and that's how a lot of the results people did it back in that era. We exchanged results. There was a huge network of people who we could rely on. I mentioned trading with correspondence. Obviously, if I got information from a guy like Tom Burke, I don't know, some of these names I'd throw out you wouldn't know. Maybe you do, but Tom Burke or the Scott Teals or Evan Ginsberg, and just on and on. Dave Brzezinski, and so on and so on. Boyd Pierce in Texas. You go in, and these guys give you information. You can trust them.
Yeah, definitely.
And so we trusted each other. About 2007, and I'll tell you where I learned about results, how important they were. 51 years ago, this past month, I met a guy named Jim Melby. And I was 17 years old at the time, and Jim was 19. We found out we lived in the same city, St. Paul, at the time. We'd both been going to the wrestling matches for the same number of years. We hadn't met. And Jim and I got together and we became close friends. And what fascinated me about Jim was that he was really into results. And up until that time, I had a fascination for it, but I never did it the way Jim. And Jim had old index cards, the little index file cards.
Yep.
And he'd have them in different territories and different things. And we came up with the ideas of him and I about, wouldn't it be fun if you could do a record on a wrestler and know everything, all the territories that he'd been from when he started and to where he is today. And so we started doing that. So I learned this from what I considered to be the master, and that was Jim. And throughout the years, Jim also did a lot of results worth research. And him and I used to go to libraries together. Well, in 2007, Jim passed away, and he had a decades run with diabetes, and it caught up with him at age 55, and he passed away. And I came up with the idea at the time. I was on the board of directors of the Cauliflower Alley Club, which I just want to say this. I got on the Cauliflower Alley Club board of directors by being brought in by three guys. Dick Beyer, who fans will remember as the Destroyer, also Dr. X in the AWA territory, Nick Bockwinkel, and Red Bastine. And the three of them were on the board of directors of the CAC. And they brought me in. They said, you need to be on this. And you need to be on this board because the CAC is all about preserving the kayfabe era and even the current era now. So I was on the board of directors when Jim Melby passed away. And I made a motion to the board. I said, there's an area of professional wrestling that has not been acknowledged. And I said, that's the work that historians do, the people that keep the wacky world of wrestling straight. The wrestlers themselves, and I mean this with no disrespect to any of the wrestlers, but the vast majority of them do not remember a lot about their careers. Right. And they remember things differently than the way they really were. And so when you're doing research for anything wrestling related, I have found that usually the wrestler is not the best one to ask. You can get information from them, but a lot of times you're going to have, Greg Gagne always tells me, he says, I got to call you so that I get it straight, because when I talk to this person, I want to make sure I got it right. Well, so I brought it up with the CAC about doing a historian award, honor a historian each year at the reunion. With God as my witness, I never, ever did that with the idea that I personally would benefit from that award.
Yep.
I'll leave that alone for right now. But I said, I know of so many great historians that that Jim Melby would be excited to see honored for the work they've done to preserve wrestling history. The board loved it. They gave me the authority to pick the historian in forthcoming years. The first one I picked, without any thought process at all, I said, well, the first one I want to honor, and I said, I know Jim would agree with this, is Scott Teal. So in 2008, Scott Teal was our first recipient of the James C. Melby Historian Award. The next year, a couple years go by, and we had a couple more. Well, in 2011, I stepped off the board, primarily because I wasn't able to be as involved with Cauliflower Alley, and I wasn't able to get to the reunion for a couple of years. And I just felt I wasn't able to, do what I was supposed to be doing with them. So I'm off the board. And in 2013, I get a call from Jason Sanderson, who was on the board. And he says, George, the board has voted that they want you to be the 2013 honoree for the Melby Award.
Right.
He said, wow. Now, like I said, I had never planned that, but I'm honored, and I was honored, and I accepted the award, and it's a high honor, and they still give out the Melby Award up until I think a year ago. I don't know if they did last year or not. I can't remember.
Yep.
But
well, that's really cool.
It's an award that recognizes those that are preserving wrestling history. So I got to share this story with you because this is the proud moment.
Okay.
I'm at the Gulf Coast Wrestlers Reunion in early March of 2013. I'm there. Scott Teal is there, and a couple of other related historians, but basically it was a group. The Gulf Coast was only for wrestlers or those in the business. So to be included in that was also an honor. Dick Beyer, the destroyer, is there. And Dick and I were talking because we'd been friends since 1970. And I said to Dick, I sit down with him at the table and I said, Dick, I'm going to get the historian award at Cauliflower next month. And he says, I know that. Now, Dick is still on the board of directors at this point. He says, I know that. And I said, well, Dick, I have a favor to ask of you. I was wondering if you'd be so kind as to be the presenter for me of the award. And you'd have to be there, but our hands were on the table. Dick took his hand, put it on top of my hand, and he said, it would be an honor. Okay. Now I have to tell you, this is where even then, as a fan, putting my fan hat, I could mark out. I had a rush when he said that. And I went over and I called my wife. She was at home. I'm down in Alabama at the Gulf Coast reunion. And I said, I got to tell you something. I said, I told her the story about Dick. And I said, I'm excited about the award, but what Dick just said, that means more to me than anything. Well, the following month at the Cauliflower Alley reunion, Dick got up at the podium, and I wished I'd have recorded the speech because, as they say in wrestling, he put me over. And at the end, he said, you deserve all of this, and how he said it and everything. But that's where I come from with the wrestling business. And the other day when I was talking to Scott Teal about our review subject here tonight, Scott and I were talking, and he said to me, he said, when he does a lot of his bios, he lets the wrestler get as deep into their lives as they want to and choose to be. And he said, some of them will come out with their stories about how they were with the ring rats and, whose wife they were doing and, the whole thing in the business. And I told him, I said, well, you and I both know that isn't what my book was about. It wasn't going to be about that. And so again, that goes back to the reviewer that you needed to read the book. And it wasn't about what you wanted to read. It was about what was in there, and you should have reviewed it on that content. And if you did, you're going to. The other thing is I don't know Chris Schramm, so I'm not trying to knock the guy or anything. I don't think he was a fan of my era of wrestling. I think he was more of a modern day wrestling fan, and that's not the guy that should be reviewing a kayfabe book. Yeah. Let's put it that way.
Well, let's get to some questions here. Some people got some comments that are coming in here before we let you get out of here. Let's see. George, I side with you on this. Screw negative reviews. Everyone's a critic. And then someone wrote, along with this book, George has 2 other AWA record books. That's his
Actually, I have 3.
Oh, 3. Okay. All right.
I have 3. And let me just say that we talked about all the results and the things that I'm interested in. I came out with AWA results record books. The first one was the 1960s. And it is wrestling card by wrestling card for every card in the AWA for a particular year. And saying that, I will remind people that there are some that aren't in there because wrestling research, results research is never done. And since I published that first book, I found additional cards. So if I do a revision, then I also have the AWA record book, the 70s. It's book 1, 1970 to 74. And then I have the 70s book 2, part 2, 75 to 79. And in all of those books, I do have tons of little, aside from the results, I have trivia or fun fact things that I put in. And again, I specifically tell you why a guy wasn't on a card when he was scheduled to be, or what happened behind the scenes that prevented him to be there, or he really wasn't injured, but he did this instead. All of those are included in there. And then I give historical notes about certain wrestlers.
Yep.
That backgrounds of different names and things. So thank you for that plug on the other books.
All right, let's see. What would George say Minnesota did that impacted the future of wrestling and what it would become?
I think the best answer to that is that we had Vern Gagne. And Vern Gagne was an amateur wrestler and a football player out of the University of Minnesota. He was an alternate on the Olympics in 1948. And he played professional football, but decided pro wrestling was where he wanted to go. And Vern Gagne was the real deal when it comes to some of the fans out there will know about shooters and hookers, that sort of thing in wrestling. Those were wrestlers that legitimately could protect themselves in the ring if someone got cute with them. And you'll hear people say, did so-and-so ever shoot on somebody? Well, that means, did he make it real?
Right.
Instead of the running away from the script or whatever you want to call it. So Vern Gagne was the real deal. As a result, what his impact was on Minnesota and the AWA and wrestling in general is that Vern believed that a wrestler had to know how to wrestle first. And then we will teach you the character or allow you to have a gimmick or something like that if you need it. And Vern ran professional wrestling camps periodically throughout the decades where he would have 10 or 12 guys that want to be wrestlers. And they come out. Vern he had an old barn out in Mound, Minnesota. And in this cold barn, no heat in the winter times. And if you live in the Midwest, in the winter time, it's cold. Well, he would bring these guys out there that want to be wrestlers, and he would literally work their butts off. He wouldn't teach them about the inner workings of the business, but he'd work them out. And after the first day or two of the 10 or 12 guys that would be there, you'd be down to 3 or 4, maybe sometimes 2. And those were the guys that would finish that particular camp. So now what you need to do, and you say, what did Vern bring to Minnesota and to professional wrestling? You look at the landscape of professional wrestlers in the 1960s and 70s, and even actually the 50s, and you look at the list of wrestlers that were in the business that had received their initial wrestling training from Vern Gagne, and it's a list of well over 150 wrestlers. I could give you some names.
Who are some guys that I would know that I grew up watching the WWF from WrestleMania 1 on.
All right, but if you go backwards now, remember this, backwards. Blackjack Mulligan.
Okay.
Big Bob Windham. Larry the Axe Hennig. Blackjack Lanza. Baron von Raschke. Ken Patera. Bulldog Bob Brown. The Anderson brothers, Gene, Lars, and Ole Anderson. Gene Anderson was first trained by Vern. Then Larry Heineme came in 1965 and was trained by Vern with help from Gene Anderson. And Larry became Lars Anderson with Gene as a brother combo. A year or so later, Al Rogowski comes to Vern for training. Alan Rogowski. He started his career as Rock Rogowski in the Minneapolis territory, AWA. And eventually he moved on to the South and became Ole Anderson.
Yep.
One of the greatest wrestlers, bookers in the business, promoters. So he had 3 Anderson brothers. I said Bulldog Bob Brown, Baron von Raschke, Greg Gagne, Jim Brunzell, Bob Bruggers, one of the greatest of all time to most people. The Nature Boy, Ric Flair, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. I mean, those are some of the bigger names.
Yeah, right.
Boy, I'm leaving off a ton of them. So many guys came to Vern and got their training.
Jesse Ventura, right?
Jesse Ventura was trained by Eddie Sharkey.
Okay.
Yeah, he got his training from Eddie Sharkey. But Paul Pershman, Playboy Buddy Rose, Vern Gagne's trained. the list is phenomenal. So the idea is what did he bring to Minnesota? It's not only what he brought to Minnesota, it's what he brought to wrestling. Because when Vern would train his boys for Big Scott, you ever hear of the Irwin brothers? Scott Hogg Irwin, Wild Bill Irwin?
Maybe.
Okay, well, Scott Irwin was in the WWF as one of the Yukon Lumberjacks back in the early 70s.
Okay.
He was a Gagne trainee. Buddy Wolf, if you heard that name, beautiful Buddy Wolf, he was a Gagne trainee. The Boogie Woogie Man, handsome Jimmy Valiant, he was a Vern Gagne trainee. Started out as Jim Vallon for Vern.
How about the Iron Sheik?
The Iron Sheik came from the Gagne camp. Yes, by all means, in the same camp that Greg Gagne and Jim Brunzell were in. Khosrow Vasiri was in that camp. Chris Taylor, one of the great Olympians who unfortunately, due to health issues, passed away early. Also a wrestler that I know everybody's heard of, Dick the Bruiser.
Yep.
Vern Gagne helped train and brought him into the business back in 1955.
Wow.
So the list is phenomenal. And what Vern would do is then in the first year when he'd get the guy, Sergeant Slaughter, that's a Vern Gagne trainee. Bob Remus came out of the 1975 or 76 camp. And he was out of the camp. Just about any name you can think of, a big name, at some point they had a Vern Gagne tie.
Cool. All right,
so Vern would have
a word. Do you have any stories about anybody like Ricky Steamboat or Dick the Bruiser or anybody like that?
Like, what do you mean by stories?
I don't know. Like how any matches that stand out to you at all, or?
Oh boy, that's always tough for me because I saw so many matches, and I guess the thing I enjoyed the most about guys like that is you see them from the onset. I saw Ric Flair in his very first pro match.
Wow.
So you see this, and this is gonna sound like I'm insulting him, but I'm not. You see this big fat kid, because Ric Flair was about 310 pounds when he first came out of the Gagne camp. And if you look at any of his younger pictures, you joined my website or my wrestling page. You scroll through it, you'll find some very early pictures of Ric Flair. But Ric Flair originally, and the story about Ric Flair, and this has been told many times, Ric came into the camp, and after a few days, he was one of those guys that said he couldn't take it and he was leaving. And Vern saw a talent in Ric Flair, and he said, "This is BS. You're coming back to the camp." He literally went over to Ric's house and told him, "You're coming to the camp." He got him in there. And, when I said Ric Flair, probably one of the greatest professional wrestlers ever, you ask any modern day fan or, from the 80s on, Ric Flair is up there on the top of the list as being the greatest. So I saw Ric Flair in his early matches, and I'll tell you what, he was a clumsy kid. His first matches, I looked at him and I really thought, how can this guy make it? And he reminded me more of Dusty Rhodes at that time in Dusty's career in the mid 70s when Rick started. And in a way, Rick was trying to pattern himself after Dusty as well. But eventually, he left the territory at the urging of Wahoo McDaniel, because Wahoo had went down to the Carolinas and was wrestling. And Rip Hawk, I don't know if you ever heard that name. He was a veteran wrestler at the time, probably about 10 or 15 years older than Ric Flair at the time, probably 15. And Rip Hawk was at the downside of his career, if you want to call it that.
Yep.
But still a good worker. So they needed, what they do in tag teams a lot in that era was they put an older guy with a younger guy and they could complement each other. And then the older guy could take the fall and the newer guy could get the push, that sort of thing. So Wahoo thought that Ric Flair, as a young Ric Flair, would be a good partner for Rip Hawk. And they did. They worked together for a while. And so Rick got some of his experience. The thing with Rick is that he never came back home because he was raised in Edina, Minnesota. And he never came back home because he found his niche in the South. And then eventually, being part of the NWA championship era. And So a lot of times what Vern would do is his wrestlers would come in after their training. He'd have them work in the AWA in some preliminary matches, work with different wrestlers, get their back, their roots about them in the ring. And then he'd call another promoter. He'd say, hey, I got this kid up here. Could you use them and let them work against some of your boys and get some experience? And so a lot of times it was Eddie Graham. He'd send them to Florida. That's what happened to Ricky Steamboat. He came out of Gagne's camp as Dick Blood. His real name is Richard Blood. That in itself is a great wrestling name, Dick Blood. But he was a baby face, and he called up Eddie Graham and he said, I got this young kid up here, and can you have him work with some of your guys? And Ricky Steamboat, he dubbed him Ricky Steamboat down in Florida, Eddie did, because Sam Steamboat was a veteran wrestler at the time. And they put some family lineage in there for Ricky to be the younger cousin or brother or whatever. I think he was supposed to be the younger brother for a short time anyway.
Right.
And so that's where that came about. But the other thing is, when I say that, we go back to that territory thing again. When we had 25, 30 territories, there were on any given day, as I mentioned to you earlier, there was a wrestling card any night of the week, anywhere USA, sometimes multiple cards. And there were probably about 3,000 wrestlers, 3,000, that could go to any territory and make a living. Now, we're not talking the enhancement talent guys. We're not talking what they referred to as the jobbers. We're talking the main event top tier stars. There were probably about 3,000 of them that could go anywhere around the country and work. When the territories were eliminated, there was no place for any of these people to go. And you look at the WWE, and I'm using a comparison here. Today, they might have 100, maybe 150 guys on their roster at any given time. But if they're not working for the WWE, for the most part, they're not working in wrestling. Mm-hmm. They could go to some of the little independents and not make any money. There's always some upstart groups that try to, run competition to Vince, but it doesn't work. And the other thing that was great about Vern, going back to that story, is that when these guys that he trained would go to these other territories and not only work in his own territory, the name Don Morocco. I know you do.
Of course.
Don Morocco got his training from Vern Gagne, his initial training. When he's working here for his initial training, think about this. In the territory at the time, there is Ray Stevens, Nick Bockwinkel, superstar Billy Graham, Ivan Koloff, Billy Robinson, Jeff Ports, Wahoo McDaniel, Larry Hennig, Dusty Rhodes, Dick Murdoch. Now, those are names. And this is what Don Morocco gets to work with. How can you not, if you've got the talent and you've got the mindset, how can you not become great working with those guys?
Yep.
So then Don moves on and goes to Texas and to Florida and to California and to the WWF and works with all of the talent in those territories. Don Morocco was one hell of a great worker. He was one of the best in my opinion. And he learned from the best. Absolutely the best.
Let's get two more in here. Let's see. Any thoughts on early Mean Gene?
Oh, yeah. And I cover this a little bit in my Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling because I cover the announcers. When I was growing up in the 50s, we had Marty O'Neill, who was a local sports celebrity, baseball player, radio personality. And Marty did all-star wrestling all through the 50s and into all through the 60s. He was the voice. Now, here's what Marty O'Neill was. Marty O'Neill was probably 5'6", I'm guessing. Just a little guy, stand there, and he'd deliver a line to the wrestlers, let the wrestler run with it on their interview. Promote the matches. Marty would have his little catchphrase at the end of the program. He'd say, because normally we'd have live wrestling and then a live card after the show at the arena. Marty would always say, okay, fans, run, don't walk to get your tickets. Marty was very low key. When Marty, Gene Okerlund was a marketing executive at the TV station that All Star Wrestling was on. And Gene also had a radio background. He'd been a DJ on wrestling or on the radio. He went by the name of Gene Leader on his radio days. But he was a marketing executive. And on this particular live night of wrestling in 1973, Marty O'Neill was a member of a broadcast union, and they were on strike. And Marty wouldn't cross the picket line. Vern's got a show to do. So he goes up to Gene Okerlund in a mad rush. He says, I got to get the show on. We got to do the show. Can you do it? Gene had some broadcasting background. So Gene Okerlund came out, and in his initial outings for a couple of weeks, what they do is they would tape about 3 or 4 weeks of wrestling in one sitting, the matches.
Sure, of course.
And do interviews that they would send out to the towns. Mm-hmm. And so Gene initially was not the Mean Gene that we later saw him morph into. But his personality, to answer the person's question, was completely the opposite of what Marty O'Neill was. And in the beginning, I can tell you firsthand that when Gene would come to the wrestling ring, there were fans that booed him because he wasn't Marty. And that's the old story when you're following the existing person or the legend, if you want to call him. It's hard to fill the shoes. So no matter who you are, you probably have to accept some disappointment. Well, then Marty came back, and he was back a normal schedule. Well, shortly thereafter, it was a couple years, but shortly thereafter, Marty started having some heart problems, and he wasn't able to do the show. And they called on Gene again, and that's when Gene pretty much took over. Now, we also had other announcers that were there, semi-regular guys like Roger Kent and others. But Gene became our first one. Now, here was the difference between Mean Gene and Marty. Gene, and it worked for his era going forward, Gene started to become a personality in his own right. He would make facial expressions, and he would make comments to the wrestlers when they'd be talking. So using Jesse Ventura, for example, who, by the way, is the one that gave him the Mean Gene name, Jesse would say some outlandish thing on his interview, and Gene would go, oh, come on now, Jesse. Marty O'Neill would have never done that. And Gene kind of had that kind of rapport with the wrestlers. So it was evolving into his character. And eventually Gene became part of the show, and he did very good at it. And when Jesse gave him the Mean Gene name, he started off one time by saying, let me tell you something, Mean Gene. And it fit. And he became Mean Gene. But Gene, absolutely a phenomenal announcer. And as wrestling went national in 1984, we know that Vince McMahon, as he needed Hulk Hogan, or thought he did, took him from the AWA. He also took Mean Gene for his national face in 1984-85. And Gene was perfect for that environment. And he worked well during that era. Now, so I think he's a phenomenal, and I knew Gene not as well, certainly not as well as I knew Marty, but I had a chance to talk with Gene and sit with him at different times. Totally different personality, great guy. And I'm good friends with Gene's son, Todd Okerlund. We talk now.
Bobby Heenan was in Minnesota, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So what was he the same as I would have seen with Bobby the Brain, or what was his personality like when he was in AWA?
What you saw, well, in the WWF, before it became E, let's go before 2000, when Vince was doing his Tuesday Night Titans and those different skit shows and things that he was doing, along with Gorilla Monsoon, that really wasn't the Bobby Heenan that we had. That was evolving into more the character that Vince wanted him to use for the skits and kind of play the buffoon at times and that sort of thing. But Bobby Heenan, he was always the arrogant, cocky, big mouth, loudmouth manager that you saw. And the thing about Bobby is that you could put him on the microphone and he could, if you listened to him, man, you could both laugh and you could both like, would you shut the hell up, because in his heel days and that sort of thing. But he was phenomenal. And the thing about Bobby is that most of the wrestlers that Bobby worked with or around, they would tell you that you could put Bobby Heenan in the ring, and Bobby wasn't a wrestler. I mean, he wasn't trained to be a wrestler, but he was more entertaining at times, and the fans loved it when Bobby could get the crap beat out of him more than they did some of the most hated heels. The announcer could come in and say that Ray Stevens isn't going to be here tonight. He missed his airplane flight, but promoter Wally Carbo says that because Heenan's his manager, he's got to take his place. And the fans would erupt. I mean, they didn't care that Ray Stevens, who by himself was a phenomenal worker.
Mm-hmm.
But Bobby Heenan was great. And Bobby was so good. So good. Absolutely one of the greatest talents ever in pro wrestling.
Let's see. We'll end it right here. Let's see. When exactly did Vern's Barn training camps begin? We hear about them beginning with Patera, Flair, Sheik, and then afterward Chris Taylor and Slaughter. But did they predate that?
Oh yeah, the ones with Patera and Greg and Sheik and all those were in the early 70s. They came out of the 72, 73 camp. But when I had mentioned earlier about some of these guys, when you talk about Don Morocco and Dick the Bruiser, and another guy that Vern trained, I know you'll recognize this name, the Freebirds, Fabulous Freebirds. Well, Freebird Buddy Roberts was trained by Vern Gagne. He came in and he was working out of Canada in 1969. He came in here and he wrestled as Buddy Smith. His real name was Dale Hay, Hey, but he wrestled as Buddy Smith, getting his training. And then after his training here, he left and he went down to the Mid-South, and it was Cowboy Bill Watts who was promoting in the Mid-South at the time in 1970, 71. He brought in Buddy Smith as Pretty Boy Buddy Roberts and teamed him up with Jerry Brown as the Hollywood Blondes. And they had a career all over the country together as a team. So, yeah, it predates it. I mentioned the Anderson brothers and Von Raschke and Bulldog Brown. Oh, man, I wish I had the list in front of me. I mean, it's like names. It's literally a who's who of the business.
Right. No, that's great. Well, the book is called The Minnesota Golden Age of Wrestling. And where can people find it? Amazon? Where else?
Amazon is probably the best place. You can get it at any bookstore. You can order it at the bigger bookstores.
Okay.
Barnes & Noble being the best, and it's on. You can get it at barnesandnoble.com, and it's out there. And it's I'm a little biased, but it's a good book.
No, it sounds like a great book and a great. And we had talked before. I've always thought that. I wish that there was something for WWF, at least in the era that I grew up in, where I could go back and read and have it be a chronological, description of like a summary of like Tuesday Night Titans and then Primetime Wrestling and then Superstars of Wrestling leading up to the pay-per-views.
Yeah, I don't think
if you go on the network, it's impossible to follow it the way that, because it's just all jumbled around.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, and again, I say this with no disrespect intended. I think so much of the problem today is the stuff on the WWE is you have to realize that Vince McMahon to this very day still changes all of wrestling history to the way he wants it to be, not the way it was.
Mm-hmm.
And he will continue to do that, not only with wrestlers' careers, but in his early years when he was taking over the world, he brought in guys like Harley Race, Dusty Rhodes, and so many others. And they didn't have a past before they came to him. And that's sad in its own way because, that these guys had he wouldn't acknowledge that Harley Race was a 7-time or 8-time, depending on who you want to talk to. He really was a 7-time, but most people are going to say he was 8.
Right.
A 7-time NWA champion, Vince would never admit that. He created the King gimmick for him and kind of made him a cartoon character. And Vince has done that successfully. So, I'm not knocking it. It's all about putting people in the seats. I want to tell you a funny story because I think this really explains the difference of if you got time.
Sure.
The difference between wrestling back then and today. In 1968, July, for the very first, we had the Crusher and the Bruiser in the AWA on and off for years. And you want to talk about a great tag team? Yeah, they were it. They were going to be wrestling against Mad Dog Vachon. And for the very first time in the AWA, Mad Dog's little brother, Butcher Vachon. Butcher had never been here before. Oh, I take that back. I could correct that because he had been here, but nobody knew it. If you want to know, I'll tell you that later. So I'm excited. I'm 16 years old or whatever I was. And my gosh, Mad Dog and Butcher. I've heard about the Butcher, and this is great. The Vachons against the Crusher and the Bruiser. I got to go see this. So as a normal, typical, dumb little kid, I got a big piece of cardboard, and I took out the magic markers, and I made this humongous sign, Mad Dog and Butcher versus Crusher and Bruiser, battle of the century, and I bring it in, and it's huge. You unroll it, and it's huge. And I go to the card. I get to the wrestling matches. Well, I get to the card, and as I'm getting to my seat, 2 ushers come over, and they ask me, what have I got there? And I said, I made a sign for, and I go through the story. Oh, well, you can't, what are you going to do with it? Well, I'm going to hold it up, Well, you can't do that. You can't do that. I said, of course I can. No, you can't do that. You're going to block people's view and nobody's going to be able to see. And so you have to give it to us. They took my sign, my poster. And of course I was ticked off, but I got over it, but what they were doing in that era was that was normal. Fans came to the matches and they sat in their seats and you didn't block someone else's view. Well, now here's the irony. You turn on Monday Night Raw or Friday Night SmackDown now, and for the past 20 years, 30 years, everybody in the audience has a 20 by 20 billboard they're holding up with names of wrestlers and catchphrases and everything on it. Am I right?
Yeah.
The arena is filled with them. In fact, the WWE even passes them out to some people when they come in to fill the arena. So the irony of it is that's how the business has changed, where now it's more about the signs and the getting on camera that you were on TV holding up your sign and the music for the entrance to the ring, like we talked about, and the fireworks going off. And that's the difference to the business today. It's just evolved. So very quickly, Butcher Vachon, the promoters, AWA tells us, has never been here before. Mad Dog's bringing in his younger brother. First time ever. Well, I've got the programs to prove it. Butcher Vachon was here, Minneapolis, many times in 1958 and 57, but he wasn't Butcher Vachon. He was a Russian. Nikolai Zolotov.
Right.
At the time. And he was here. It was pretty much when he was just a few years into the business, but he was here. But they never told you stuff like that. And, 10 years later, he comes in, and of course, the fans aren't going to remember. And how many fans were around 10 years later? Wrestling was cyclical with fans. Fans would follow it for a year and then drop off and never watch it again. Or they'd watch it for a time period when a certain wrestler was in the territory. And when that wrestler was gone, well, they lost interest. Then there were diehards that were fans for their life, and they're addicted to this sickness like I am. So there you go.
Well, all right, we're gonna one last question here because someone just asked it. If Gagne put the belt on Hogan, would Hogan have stayed, and would Gagne went national earlier? That's a great question.
It's a phenomenal question, and it's been asked so many times. And I don't know that there's a right answer, and I don't know that there's an answer that people will buy. I can give you a perspective and an opinion, okay? When Vince McMahon came in and tried to take Hogan, first of all, I want to back up. When Hulk Hogan came to the AWA, I invite people to go out and find the interview on YouTube when Hulk Hogan was making his debut in the AWA. He was coming in as a heel, and he was managed by luscious Johnny Valiant. The reason he had a heel manager and a mouthpiece, because those that remember Johnny Valiant know that he was very good on the mic. The reason they had that was because if you listen to Hulk Hogan talk in those first couple interviews, the guy stumbled over his tongue. He couldn't talk. Vern taught him how to work on interviews. Johnny Valiant taught him how to work on interviews and what he evolved into. And Hulk did good for what his shtick was with his interviews later on. So when Hulk Hogan took over as being huge in the AWA, that's where Hulkamania started, folks. You can say that McMahon created it, but he didn't. Hogan had been in the WWF before he came to the AWA, and Vince didn't know what to do with him. In fact, he had Andre the Giant beat him as a heel in the WWF, or I guess it would have been WWF by then. But anyway, so Hogan is huge over here in the AWA. And we have the greatest wrestling champion at the time in Nick Bockwinkel. Now you got to understand Vern Gagne again, going back to what Vern brought to Minnesota. Vern wanted a wrestler first and a character second. With Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby Heenan in his corner for 5 years, Vern had a meal ticket that he couldn't overcome. It was great. Bockwinkel was perfect. And Nick was devoted to Vern in that, and he was a good enough wrestler that if he needed to protect the business, he would. In the ring, he'd shoot on somebody if he had to. And he also was, if Vern wanted him to drop the title, he would. Vern had the perfect champion. He never had to worry about him. So Hogan, over big, huge. Now, a lot of people always say to me, well, Hulk Hogan was the reason we had all these huge crowds. Well, I remind them that at the same time we had the Sheik, Adnan Casey, who you might remember as Billy White Wolf. I don't know if you go back that far in the WWF. Okay. Well, we had the Sheik, who was over so much. So he was so evil. And we had Jerry Blackwell, who for his size was a phenomenal worker. That's all I can tell you. And we had the High Flyers. We had Jesse Ventura. We had Ricky Martel. We had Tito Santana. And the list goes on. Hogan was part of this. And wrestling was starting to have a boom all over the country, not only in the AWA. But Hogan is huge in his matches with Bockwinkel. Vern, and I stand by him on this. He didn't need to take the title off of Nick. He needed to have a challenger like Hogan that the fans believed could kick the crap out of Nick and got gypped out of it. You know, and that made the perfect scenario. Now, here's the deal to answer the question. If Vern would have put the title on Hogan, in my heart of hearts, and Greg Gagne agreed with me on this when we've talked about it, Hogan would have still left with the title. He'd have left. And he'd have probably tossed it in a garbage can on the air in the WWF, the same as Medusa Michelli did when she was the AWA Women's Champion and went to the WWF and threw it in the garbage can on the air when she came in there. I think she was Alondra Blaze or something was her name. But Hogan was going to leave regardless. Vern and him also had an issue over some royalty money on merchandise. And Hogan wanted to do his Japan commitments. And Vern also did not want Hogan gone from the territory if he was champion. and he would be gone for 4, 5, 6 weeks at a time. That was another reason. And Hogan wasn't going to commit to the AWA in full. So when Vince comes shopping for his poster boy, Vince came up with the idea to go national. Vince is 33 years old at the time, just a young kid. Comes up with the idea to go national. He's got to come up with a, as I called him, a poster boy, the wrestler that you could build your promotion around. Hogan was the perfect choice at that point. And he came in, and really what happened, and it's sad behind the scenes, was Vince had made a trip to Minneapolis and basically asked Vern Gagne to sell the AWA to him. And Vern said, the hell with you. Vern had the best promotion in the business and guaranteed any wrestler of any merit in that era and before, they wanted to work in the AWA for two things. One was the money was good, and the schedule was a lot less than any other territory for wrestling. So they could make a good living and have time off with their families. So Vince came in, Vern drew well and always had people happy. So when Vince comes in and said he wanted to buy the AWA, Vern said, no way. So then Vince gets to Hogan and says, I can promise you this. I'm going to take you. I'm going to give you the title. We'll put the belt on you. We're going to go mega size. He did it. And it is a true story that he took Hogan, Vince did, and he actually paid Hogan to not show on his pre-scheduled AWA cards. Now, the AWA had, as I said earlier, they taped several shows in a row. So these shows are 4 weeks out. Hogan's being advertised all over. Well, you can't produce them. Now, the right thing would Ben Vern should have come forward. He didn't. We can give him that. But in those days, they just explained that Hogan didn't come. He wasn't there. Hogan went to the WWE, or F at the time, WWF, and he did a little shyster work on his own. He told, I don't know how many people know this, he told Vince McMahon, a part of my coming is I want Dr. D. David Schultz to come with me. Now, anybody that followed the AWA for the 2 years before Hogan left, they know that one of the hottest programs was Hogan versus Schultz. Their matches were incredible. Schultz, in my opinion, made them great because Hogan was the type of a wrestler, and I say this going back to the territory days, he was the type of a wrestler that was so good on the mic and so much on charisma. He didn't need to have a lot of talent, but he needed wrestlers to make him look good and better than he was. And as long as that happened, Hogan was spectacular. So David Schultz was a great opponent. Anti everything Hogan was, Dr. D was it. But they were friends, and they were making money together. So Schultz went as well. The AWA explained it that Dr. D. David Schultz had been suspended because he had gotten into, he was always being disqualified, and his character parlayed that. So they said he was suspended. So that was part of the deal. So now Vince has taken Vern's #1 program at the time, 2 guys against each other. Then, at Hogan's recommendation, and well worth it, it fit in, he said, you should bring Gene Okerlund over. So a lot of people will say, was Vince McMahon targeting Vern Gagne specifically? Yeah. He took his 2 top guys at the time and his announcer, who was good for what Vince wanted to do, because Gene was more the carnival barker type announcer, and that fit him. He was good at it. And then he took Jesse Ventura. And then he talked other wrestlers into leaving. Vern ran head-to-head without Hogan, without Schultz, without Okerlund, without Jesse, and a few others. He ran head-to-head on cards when Vince was coming into the Twin Cities and other AWA cities. Vern would run a card, Vince would run a card. Sometimes they were even on the same night. for a wrestling fan, it was great because we were getting to see some great cards. But Vern actually held his own, and I have the programs and the records to prove this. Vern actually outdrew Vince until about mid 1985, early 86 on the cards when Vince was coming into the AWA territory. And Vince was coming in with Vern's wrestlers.
Mm-hmm.
Hogan, Adonis, Ventura, Schultz, so on. He took Rene Goulet, took Mad Dog Vachon. And here's to Vern's credit. Vern was a guy that was fair with you. I mean, I'm telling you this, it's the truth. The wrestlers in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, early 80s, they will tell you that Vern kept his word. Vern paid you what he was promised to pay you. And when Vince McMahon came to Mad Dog Vachon, and Mad Dog was really hot in the territory, but he's in the declining years of his career. He's already getting close to 60. And Vince came to Mad Dog and told him to come to the WWF. He's going to pay him good money. Mad Dog was able at that point to take the money because, as he said, he was nearing the end of his career. And Vince only wanted Mad Dog so that when he went into an AWA territory, he could bring Vachon and put him on the card somewhere. Mad Dog wasn't headlining in the WWF.
Mm-hmm.
Here's to Vern's credit. The night of, I don't have the date in my head, but Mad Dog Vachon was scheduled to wrestle against King Kong Brody, Bruiser Brody. He was King Kong in the AWA out of respect to Dick the Bruiser, by the way. They wouldn't call him Bruiser. I don't know if fans knew that or not, but that's why he was King Kong. So Mad Dog is scheduled to wrestle against Brody. Before the card starts, before the match, Mad Dog went to Vern behind the scenes. And he said, I'm going to be up front with you. He said, Vince has approached me. He's offered me some good money to come in and I don't have to work as hard right now. And I told him I would take it. And so I'm going to finish up my program, my dates here with you. And I'll go out there tonight, wrestle Brody. And Vern, to his credit, I mean, he had a killer match on his hands here. Fans would have loved Brody against the Mad Dog. I'm telling you. I would have. Because Mad Dog was a scrapper. He was great. You know, everybody knows how good Brody was. So Vern, to his credit, he's told the Dog, he said, no. He said, you take the offer, and I don't want you to go out there tonight. And he put in a substitute against Brody. He could have been ticked off. Vern could have been ticked, and he could have sent the Dog out there. And who knows, as a promoter, he could have told Brody, teach him a lesson. But he didn't. Mm-hmm. Vern had been faithful to Mad Dog, and Mad Dog had been faithful to Vern from the early 60s when Mad Dog originally started working with Vern and was given his title for a while. Mad Dog was AWA champ for 3 years in the 60s. So, I mean, Vern was fair. So to answer the question, I don't think it would have changed things. And would Vern have went national? Oh boy, that's a can of worms. Vince McMahon had his 33 years of youth on his hands, on his side. He was adventurous. He had the pocketbook, and he was willing to risk anything and everything. Whereas the veterans like Vern Gagne, who at that time was pushing 60, and all the other veteran promoters around the country, guys like Bob Geigel and Harley Race and Sam Muchnick and Jim Barnett and Eddie Graham and Roy Schire and Don Owen and Joe Dusick and Paul Bosch. I mean, you go around the horn. All these promoters, they were of that old mindset that this territorial system had run for the past 20 years. The alliances, the AWA, NWA were strong, and it's never going to change. And Vince McMahon's a fool, and he's not going to make this work, and it'll fizzle, and he wouldn't succeed. Well, that was mistake number one. Number two is when they tried to work together to work against Vince, they would team up. You know, we'd put on these mega shows, and Vern would work with Jerry Jarrett in Memphis, and Fritz von Erich in Texas and put on these shows together. They'd bring their respective stars from their shows together. Well, the problem there is that all these promoters want their own wrestlers to be on top and to go over, and they'd fight. Who's going to be the boss? Who's going to be in charge? And Vince McMahon made an interesting comment on an interview he did for the spectacular history of the AWA DVD that Vince McMahon did. If any of you have ever watched it, Vince makes the statement that he never tried to put Vern or any other promoter out of business. But he did go on to say that I just watched them implode themselves by their own mistakes. And that's true. But he did target the AWA. Now, that AWA video I just mentioned, at the beginning of that video, they interview quite a few guys, including Greg and Vern. And there are so many mistakes in it that I cringe. But it's out there. So if you watch it and you think that's the true history, good luck. But give me a holler sometime and I'll tell you all the errors that are in it.
Well, George, thanks so much for coming on tonight. You can pick up the book on Amazon, and thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. This will be the last show until 2021. So everybody have a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Holidays, and thanks for tuning in, and hope everyone's staying safe.
Thank you, Ed. It's been fun.